I'm James Bird. I'm an assistant professor in mechanical engineering across the street. And I got to meet Kelly Krause through working with her on a cover of a Nature article, and really got to see sort of what it was like taking a picture from our high-speed camera and realizing that there's no way that could ever be on the cover because of resolution issues, because of all of these limitations that we had. And so how do we think outside the box to take images that can do a lot more? And so that's what this talk is about, is sort of best practices as we go forward and say, okay, here are images that may be appropriate for a scientific figure or for our communities, but how do we take those to the next level, even within our communities, to make sure that as much information is getting across in the most natural sense to what's distracting and what's not. So for those that weren't here earlier, Kelly Krause is the creative director of Nature, where she's been for 5 years. Before that, she was the creative director of Science for 4 years. So she has a lot of experience in this area, has a background in design, and I'm really excited to see what she has to tell us. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for those that stuck around and waited for the tutorial that were here earlier. So this session is really about scientific figures in particular. This is something, it's a topic that is getting, I think, even more interest than it used to. It's just, I've been in this for a good 9 years or so, and it's really encouraging. I think that there is a movement of designers being interested in helping scientists and working with scientists in a collaborative way, and then scientists, I think, are being asked to be designers in a way that that maybe they wouldn't have in the past. So just to sort of, that is my introduction. So essentially, I think scientists are now, be it a scientific poster or a presentation or a grant proposal or welcome, come on in, or scientific figures. Scientists are increasingly being faced with designing things to communicate their work. And I think that scientific figures are a sort of blend of two design disciplines, one being graphic design, and that's sort of design for reading and consumption of largely printed but also digital, now moving into digital. But the classic graphic design, I think people think of as the posters or the magazines. But it's really about information hierarchy. It's about balance. And one of the tools that are used is sort of a grid, designing on a grid, and there are other sort of techniques in graphic design. And then you have information design, which is designing for learning and comprehension. And this is a poster at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, and that's kind of the holy temple of information design, in case you didn't know. So it is, the signage there is legendary. So this is a poster that has very few words, and it's telling you how to get from the airport to Paris in 3 different modes of transportation, all in this one poster that's really clear. So this is information design. So that's basically what I think scientists are being tasked to do in their everyday work. And that is to say that design is not optional. Design is not an afterthought. Design is not making it pretty. It is a process, and it is your product. It is your work. So a bit about the design process. So the first thing that you want to do when you are producing a figure is to establish an information hierarchy. This is really important, and there are probably dozens of ways to go about it, but this is sort of how I recommend to people is what is the purpose? What are the key elements? And then any kind of useful context that will be needed to communicate your point, and then the details kind of come last. So some details will stay, some details will go. And so then here I have an actual example, so that's what this other stuff is that I'm going to show you. So this is an example from that actually was published in Nature, and it was actually a news and views figure, not a research figure. But it was showing an immune response to intestinal antigens. And so going through, trying to decide what to show, the key elements were, it was in a mouse model, so the animal, intestines, lymphatics, these are the things that must be shown. Useful context, well, it's all in the context of the story, which is sort of intact versus leaky lymphatics. Was part of the story. And then here's some other useful details, can we show a dendritic cell, inflamed node, the leaky vessel, the whole, visual bit. The next thing to do once and it's not always going to be a sort of process like this, maybe it's just purely data, and then let's say you have loads and loads and loads, and you're just trying to decide, it's really important to establish a hierarchy. What is the most important thing you're saying in your figure? So you take this, and then, you map it to a visualization type. Right. So, some of this is quite intuitive, right? If you have data going over time, then you're going to do some kind of line graph, probably. If you are comparing categories, a bar is the best way to go. Geography, obviously, a map. If you're trying to anything spatial, a diagram is very helpful for comprehension. Trends, scatter plot. If you have distributions, box plots are good. A lot of people do bar charts when they should be maybe doing box plots, that sort of thing. Flow charts, heat maps. There are many more visualization techniques, but I just thought I would give you a taste. So in our example, it's clearly a process, a flow chart. So that's what this example is. So the next thing is really, really, really important, is sketching. Even if it's extremely simple, what you think is very simple, sketching serves several purposes. First of all, it helps us clarify what we know. And I think, when it comes to writing, let's say, writing up your research, that's where you sort of realize you maybe have a few holes, or maybe, there are things that you don't quite understand yourself when you're writing it down. And I think the next step there is when you're going to do your figures. That's when you really realize where you have your ambiguities, right? Because I think language will allow for ambiguities, but visualization doesn't, right? So you have a cell, you have something, you have to make design decisions. You have to give something a shape. You have to give it a place. You have to make decisions about, you can see holes in your patterns of data or whatever when you sketch things out. So this is also a paper. I recommend paper and pencil. There's a pencil is a very special place because it has an eraser, and it allows you to make mistakes and be really free in your thinking in the sketch stage. And so while software tools are great, and you eventually will move into them probably, the paper and pencil allows a freedom that I think is really important to maintain, regardless of how high-tech the actual output ends up. So in this example, this was actually the work of an author, and then was edited by our editor. So you notice the blue and the red there. But so what happens is, when you sketch, you're just going to get your ideas out. You're going to sketch it all out, and then whether it's you editing it or whether you're working with someone else, to kind of co-create something. Basically, the key is to sort of look at that sketch, and that helps you see things that are like redundant elements, so things that are overlapping. And so it helps to have things sketched out. So this is, and then I thought I would just show you the final artwork. So this is how it ended up. And so on to some best practices. So I know this is a short tutorial. We don't have, I'm not going to sort of go on and on about certain things, but I thought I would hit on some of the key things that we see that can be issues. So I thought I would ask you all to do a little something. So compare the area of these two circles. So how many of the small circles do you think can fit into the large circles? And I'm opening it up to guesses. Just 8. Good. Anyone else? 10? 5? Okay, great. Okay, we have 5, 8, 10. All right. Now, do the same for the bars. 8. Anyone? Anyone else? 6? Okay, so the answer for both is 7. So you're very close. The answer for both is 7. And if you're like most people, you probably got a bit closer with in your estimate with the bars than you did with the circles. So the point being there that we are hardwired to perceive certain visual representations more accurately than others. We are very good at position. We find maps very intuitive. No one has to show us how to read a map or other things that involve position. Length, there is something, we are hardwired to look at straight lines in a very clear way. We attempt in our minds to make things straight that even aren't straight. So we are very good at estimating length. If you're going to go down, we are actually very bad at volume. It's very difficult for us to judge volume, estimate volume. And then at the very bottom, interestingly, is color, something that we use a lot of, and is one of the hardest things for us to estimate differences in value. So this is a really important point, which you may have heard before, I don't know, but when we graph things, we are encoding information, we are encoding numbers into abstractions, right? We are coding numbers into a circle, into a line. And whatever when you're creating your graphic, whatever you encode in there, someone else has to decode that, right? So you want to make it easy for them. So you think about things like this, and about how easy it is for some things to be perceived versus others, and that guides your best practices. I'm going to go into just a few topics. So one of the main purposes of visualizations is to find patterns in the data, right? And to show other people patterns in data. And there are some very useful ways of doing this. If you look here, the figure marked B, I'm sorry, it shouldn't be marked B, but but it is. So, you can use color, size, orientation, shape, motion, grouping. So these are all visual techniques to set certain bits of data aside from others, and to create contrast, because that's, you want to be able to visually perceive quickly the point of a graph. And then, then you map the salience to the relevance, right? So this will aid in comprehension immensely if you map your salient visual techniques to the relevant points of your data. And this seems like very basic, but it is a principle that really improves comprehension when looking at scientific figures. This is something that I like to talk about figures in research papers. Think about it as writing, and you might do it a bit differently, right? So if you think about a research paper, is it a place for flowery, poetic prose? Not really. That's not sort of the tone, and that would distract from what a research paper should be doing. And in the same way, for research figures within this context, it's important to resist over-decoration, to resist these sort of flamboyant design decisions that actually distract rather than helping clarify. And a similar point is to edit your figures, as I mentioned before. So go through, make your figures, but then really give a close eye to things that might be redundant elements. And look at ways, look at your figures and say, is there anything I can remove? And it still makes sense, and that actually improves it. It's just like good writing, like Thomas Jefferson said, if I had more time, I would write a shorter letter, like that sort of thing. Color, I'm going to dwell on a bit here for the next few slides, because color is very subjective. You and I probably experience color in different ways. And also color is affected by a lot of different things. And in this slide, it's looking at color is very much affected by the colors around it. So, in this first example, the two colors are the same, but to me, and I think to a lot of people, they look different, and that's because of the background. In the same way, we have two different colors that look like the same because of the background. And if you take that into a sort of commonly used technique of a heat map, if you look at where the two black stars are on that heat map, if you just take a glance at the heat map, you would think that the values are different, but it's actually the same color. Right? So be careful when using color to represent data. And again, this is just a sort of more of the same, but we discourage the use of the rainbow color scale, ordering your data by the length of wavelengths or that sort of thing. if you look at this example of the rainbow color scale, if you look at the two circles that are marked, by 2 and 3, those are two different values, but in the circle they look pretty much the same, right? And then if you go up to 4 and 5, that's the same jump, but look at the difference in the colors. So you're misrepresenting the data there. So we recommend grayscale in a lot of cases. And a good rule of thumb is if you use a gradient that goes between 10 and 90% black, that actually does a really, it's very good for quantitative representation if you're going to map that with color. And then just a few other examples here on the right. So, if you have a color scale that has a sharp transition, you can see how that's exaggerating the data range in that. And then if you look at the one below it, make sure that the colors that you've chosen in your palette have equal saturation, because the sort of light blue there just drops out. You don't even see the data there. So, so you may ask, well, how do I choose my colors? So it depends on what you're doing with color. And if you are mapping color to quantitative data, if you are using color to represent numbers, this can be dangerous, and I tell people to seek the help of experts who have already done the work for you. So there's Color Brewer, I have the links there, and then there's also NASA has done quite a lot of work on color. They have been really engaging with the visualization field over the past, many years now, to create really great divergent color scales and maps. And then this is an actual tool sort of to help. So, so that's what I suggest to people when they are using quantitative color representation. Now, for categorical data, it's actually like the danger is not quite as bad. So, and you can do it yourself if you just understand a little bit about color. So if you're using color to sort of signify different categories, right? So it's not representing a number; it's representing a category. Then you can make your own color palettes. And so if you look at this color wheel here, so you have hue, which means is it red, is it green, and then you have saturation and brightness, and you want to have different hue, lightness, and saturation in your palette. So a really good way to do that is, instead of, a lot of people will just take that sort of like horizontal bar and they'll just kind of go down and choose colors, but what they're doing is they're choosing colors of all the same saturation. So that's not going to give you a good divergent palette. So if you take the circular one and you do it in a spiral, as seen here, it will give you a really good slice of a color palette that has sort of divergent values, if that makes sense. And then you can see the result of that in the figure beside it, and then the grayscale equivalent below. And and if in doubt, it's really good practice to take your figures and either print them out on a black and white printer, or in your software change it to grayscale and see how it looks. That's a really good test to see if you have a sound color palette. Color blindness is something that we are very aware of. There is a lot of use of green and red in the biological sciences together, in heat maps and fluorescence. It's and people always ask me, they're like, well, why is there why nature do you like green and red so much? Like, we don't, but we get a lot of green and red figures, and we because we are publishing the work of others. We will make suggestions. Please do not send us green and red together, but they do. And so it's sort of this movement we are trying to communicate to people. There are better ways. So I'm here to communicate that. And there's some really easy ways to do it. So as I've shown here, that you can replace red with magenta fairly easily in imaging software, and also you can replace the green with turquoise. And in that way, so that you can see the predominantly two different kinds of color blindness there. You can see that in A, it's very difficult to make out the differences, but then, the differences are preserved there in B. And we also have this colorblind friendly color palette here that is you can see the P and D stand for the two different kinds of color blindness, that you can make out the differences in all of those colors. It's not quite as easy, but you can see the differences in the colors. And it's also, it's good practice to check your figures. In Photoshop, you can check for color blindness in the settings. And I think I'm trying to remember now. It's changed over the years. I'm sorry, but you'll be able to find it, I'm sure, yourselves. But I think it's in the proofing. You can go in and change the proof and make it, and you can check the color blindness in Photoshop. There are also tools online. If you just kind of Google, then you can upload stuff, and it will show you how things will look to a colorblind person. So. Data density is a big thing. There is so much data, and with software and different visualization techniques, there are a lot of different ways that people are trying to represent their data. But I think, we are sympathetic to the urge to show all your hard-won, hard-fought data. But it does not do anyone trying to consume your information any favors when it's all overlapping and you can't really read it. So there are a couple of techniques that help with that. So using small multiples is a good technique to be able to sort of take the sort of dense overlapping and break it out into smaller visualizations. And also if you're using, also if you have an interactive setup, then obviously you can have layers of data, but this is really talking about the static representations of data. So also think about, avoid cognitive overload, because if you have too many different kinds of things, you're not going to be able to discriminate the different levels of information there. So in this example on the bottom, it's think about breaking out your overly complex figures into maybe a couple, multiples, so maybe 2 or 3 different ways of looking at it. So it really improves clarity, and it doesn't, and you can still see the complexity of the data that you have a lot of data, but then you're able to read it. So that's our plea. Labels and arrows may seem like a small thing, but they really do. They can, if not done well, make a figure really hard to read. And so it's best, okay, well, I'll start with the arrows. So people use arrows as pointers, as labeling, a labeling technique, which we discourage. So arrows should really only be used when the relationship is directional, right? Not to point to something. And so So imagine the diagram on the left. If they all had arrows pointing to this, you might think that there's some kind of flow diagram or some sort of process happening, really. So that's just it's a common mistake, and you think it's small, but it does actually, especially in a very complex process diagram, is really confusing. So. And then arrow styles, I know this seems like a small point as well, but bad arrows can be incredibly distracting. And so, we like to say, here's some, we've just given you some ideal proportions for common line sizes there. But, avoid the sort of big, flappy arrows, the sort of open arrows. And this is all about making something quickly legible, quickly scannable. And in terms of labeling, it didn't actually come out that well, but if you look at the diagram on the bottom, you can kind of see a grid around it. So that's sort of using a grid. A grid is your friend, and a grid will give structure to your design, be it a poster or be it something small scale like a figure. Use grids, and it will help you organize your information, organize your thoughts, or organize into balance and harmony. So this is something that can be found in a lot of page design software, and also you can build your own grids in a lot of the Microsoft Word kind of and Office and Microsoft Office stuff or whatever. So the grid is your friend. It will really help you. When labeling things, sort of make all of the labels the same. Make them either all, depending on the orientation of your diagram, all horizontal or vertical, or all the same angle. And so messy labels will really make a diagram difficult to read. And here we have typography, which really the essence of typography in the context of a scientific figure is to it's just legibility, right? You really just want to be able to read it. You don't want it to be distracting. So I think most people probably know that there are serifs and sans serifs. Everybody knows about fonts these days. You don't have to be a designer. And the serif was created to lead you from one letter to the next. So in that case, the serif is recommended for large blocks of text for reading, whereas the sans serif is really good for labels. The sans serif reduces better. So if something is going to be very small, you want to use the sans serif. And so we recommend Helvetica and Arial, but also Times New Roman for a serif font. If you are putting words on things, please be mindful of contrast and also do the sort of black-white test, the sort of grayscale test rather. So, either print it out or change it into grayscale to see if your words disappear. And we are asked a lot about the optimum size for type size for printed figures. This is open to debate, but in Nature we prefer about 7-point. We find that's good for labeling within figures. If you go larger than that, it will either your figure is way too big, or it will sort of overwhelm your other elements. If it's smaller than that, people will not be able to read it. So you may as well not even have the words. So that is all that I have, but there is more. So Nature Methods has a really great column called Points of View. And it's been around for a while, and they finally this past year collected the past several years. It was a monthly column into this, and it is on sale for $7.99. This is not a plug, but it's really great. And so it's like everything that I've shown here. It goes into much more detail, and then if you're in the life sciences, it's actually really great. It goes into much more detail about visualizing biological data, genomic data, heat maps, and a lot of the techniques used in the life sciences. So if you want to go deeper, this is a good place to start. So that's all I have. Thank you. Okay.